No, I would
It would have been on the
have
final, like,
been
on the state or military.
It actually wasn't a here, and I should just assume that it's happening anyway.
There it is.
I will go. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right, so your scores are on Moodle, and the physical tests are here. I will discuss the preferred answers next week when we're doing final prep, because this is week 10. Right now I had to figure out a way of basically doing 2 decades worth of presentation in the last 3 days, and deciding what the themes were going to be. Because basically in the year 2000, we have, what's the so-called war on terror. How does that basically affect the African American experience? Well, we're considered potential domestic terrorists in the same sense that Africans in Africa fighting for indigenous sovereignty were considered terrorists by white supremacy. Like, oh, all we want is equality in our own homeland. How does that make us terrorists? All we want is, from the African point of view, all we want is, if we're working in a mine, to get paid prevailing wages, or some concept of prevailing wages, to organize as a union to be able to feed our families and have the benefits of the people who are the end users of the stuff that we're making, like cell phones.
It must be a threat to national security.
Right. So when did we begin to define national security? So day 1 of week 9, basically, since this is the only time that we're meeting, and I didn't have time to process the latest, we are only meeting once this week because of Memorial Day. Now, Memorial Day started out as a black thing during the Civil War. And it was called Decoration Day. And basically, since the United States, neither the Union soldiers nor the Confederates that allowed black people to fight for them recognized that service, we started doing that internally. And so I'll be talking about that actually more, because I think that's good enough to actually have included in the final. Meanwhile, I want to talk about partially the 90s and the I am and OJ as symbolic. All right, so we talked about that a little bit. So symbolic imagery and rhythm. Epistemology is how you know the world. It's the process by which you know the world. And so how Africans in America construct the world is encoded symbols which tell a story. All right, so a lot of times we actually focus on symbolic stuff. All right, so case in point. The Black Student Union, which in its history has helped found this class, is doing a dedication to a historical monument that's already actually installed in the Masonic Cemetery of Wiley Griffin. So Wiley was the first historically mentioned African American resident of Eugene. Now, he wasn't the first actual historical black resident of Eugene. He was just the first one mentioned in the historical record. Now, notice that the historical record is whatever the newspapers say. Now, the newspapers don't say everything. So here's a newsflash in case you didn't know that. Okay? Your contemporary newspaper is the internet. Okay, so spending time on net-based sources and the phone and all that other kind of stuff is only going to give you the picture that the people that bothered to pay to have something on their internet want you to know, which isn't everything. So Wiley Griffin, this is a symbol. So there's a historical monument. The BSU is dedicating it on June 7th, 5 o'clock in the Masonic Cemetery in the Hope Abbey Mausoleum, 5 o'clock, June 7th. So come one, come all. So this is a symbolic act, okay? Now,
Where is that cemetery?
it's 24th and University, 25th and University. Just walk up the hill to the mausoleum and we'll be there, starting at 4 or 5, or you can walk up to where he is now. So basically the story of Wiley is that he lived here for about 15 years, was an early resident. It was illegal for him to be here. He died of what we would call the flu. They called it intestinal flux. Basically you have, diarrhea and you're puking, and back then in the 19th century that could kill you, and it killed him. So he was buried because he was working as a porter for the Elks, even though it was illegal for him to be here. He was buried by the Elks Club, and the Elks later became, like 7 years after he was buried, became one of the organizational nexi of the Eugene Ku Klux Klan. Now, one of the things that the obituaries reported Wiley, that he was popular in the sense that he had a very public position, working as a janitor at the U of O, working as the graphic that is on the monument is basically of him being a tram operator for the trams that ran up and down West 11th, et cetera, those trolley tracks. And, the fare was 5 cents, and he, gave candy to kids and free rides home, and was a devout Christian, never swore, never drank, never used profanity. And one of his obituaries described him as what a Southerner would call a good nigger. Now, the fact that they published that as an obituary in 1913 gives you an indicator of the times. So if a newspaper says that a Southerner would consider him a good nigger, then surely somebody decided, would call him that who didn't like him, even though apparently he was popular with some other folks. So it's the contradiction of living in Eugene, where you have some progressive and some incredibly ignorant, and you have to deal with both, right? So where he's buried, there's about, 30, 40 unmarked graves. We used to think it was a segregated part of the cemetery, but it turns out that's not the case. But again, who else is buried there? I mean, that could be an issue. We decided to basically, go with what we knew in terms of, my wife and I, she did the original research. I began looking at incorporating the African-American parts of the research because we found there's hidden history here of people of color. And our project I2M Eugene is basically talking about, taking its title from a Langston Hughes poem, I2M America. So there's a hidden history, not just of black people, but all people of color. How do you bring it out? And why has it been hidden? And so, how come nobody's heard of Wiley Griffin except a few history buffs? And why are those history buffs? And those history buffs do or do not talk about, the history of his times. So that is a symbol, a monument, like renaming Martin Luther King Boulevard when it used to be named after a Klansman, or a Rosa Parks statue in the middle of town when Rosa Parks never came here, or they're symbolic things that don't necessarily change stuff, but sometimes you have to start with the symbol as a symbol of change, but not necessarily actual change. All right, so how we know the world starts, the epistemology starts with symbolic imagery and rhythm. So as an example, in axiology, the crossroads. So the inner circle is a Native American construct, which is also the medicine wheel, which basically talks about 4 races, 4 directions, 4 seasons of life, 4 actual seasons, multiple layers of symbology in one symbol. The outer symbol, you add to that the African construct of the crossroads. What that symbolizes is this inner circle is your inner world. And the outer circles are what other people can see.
Facebook.
Hmm?
Facebook.
Not exactly. This is free computers. But yes,
Well,
it could be Facebook if you're translating it for the 21st century. Okay? Facebook is still a construct. It's not necessarily showing everything. It's just what you want to show. And people don't necessarily understand. Facebook owns that data now that you shared with them. Yeah, it's your data, but they own it. And they can use it to sell you stuff or have other people know things about you. So it's not just private. And so people, again, when you rape somebody and you post the pictures on Facebook, the cops can track that. Duh. I'm not saying that none of you do that, but that's how they got this brother. It's like, wait, how do you think that raping somebody that's drunk, taking pictures, wait, you're raping somebody that's drunk and passed out, and you think it's okay to take pictures of that and then post them on Facebook?
And write your name on there.
And write your name on it? Like, first, you're raping somebody. Where is your home training? That's one. Two, then you are, football players. Yeah, in Ohio. Yeah, this is in the last year. Yeah.
The kids. So.
And this has happened, other places where, the girls who committed suicide because they got drunk, passed out, and they got raped. And then people took pictures while they got out, and they posted that stuff on Facebook. Didn't want to go off on the whole thing about Facebook, but what that does is it gives an impression of who you are, and by extension, what your character is. So in the old school, my parents basically said, whenever you go out in the world, you are not representing you. You are representing us. Okay? Black people. So you have a responsibility to act better than the craziest white people around you. You be cool. Even if they're losing their stuff, you be cool. Because you are not representing yourself. You are representing us. So act like you know something. Even be intimidating because you're smart. That makes you more dangerous. So I made it a point to kind of act like that. And sometimes be upfront about it. So go back to slide if you would. So in the axiology, developing that construct, that symbology, using this construct which looks like a target is the crossroads. So there's an inner world and an outer world. There's an invisible world that you experience internally that you may or may not talk about to outsiders, and there's an outer world that people can see and emulate. This symbol, Jin Yame, one of the Adinkra symbols, is an alphabet. Not that you use it in a sentence, but that it's a story that you're supposed to know. And so basically it means the omnipotence of God, and basically what it symbolizes is the turning of the universe. Nobody was around to see the beginning, nobody was around to see the end except God, so that's why you should accept God. That is A-C-C-E-P-T, the omnipotence of God. Or you want to tell them the short story, oh, what does that symbol mean? Let's see, do I have it? Yes, I got it. If I want to give them the short story, except for God, I fear nothing. Ooh, that's it. No, you don't know the whole story, but that's okay. Don't mess with me. So, symbolic imagery or rhythm. The logic system is the philosophy of complementary opposites and or diunitologic, the union of higher or lower self. This is basically dating back dating back to Egypt, the union of the higher and lower self, also known as in Comedian Sema, which translates basically into the Hindu word yoga, which since India was a colony of Egypt, the first Africans colonized Egypt 50,000 years ago, bringing with them the technology that is inscribed on the pyramids, yoga. So here you have Heru and Set, the higher self and the lower self, and they're forming a union. And basically what they're doing is they're using a papyrus plant and a lotus plant to yoke the breath. This is the lungs, which they are both harnessing the power of breath. So Heru, that's you, overcomes your lower self by breathing in a particular way that pushes down your ego.
And it works.
And it works.
Breathing.
The breathing part. And so when you have phrases like, okay, once you breathe right and you put your ego behind you, set, or in Aramaic as it's known as satana. So in Yeshua's time, when the phrase that got translated into English as get thee behind me, Satan, and then the story in the English European speaking world is that Satan was an evil archangel that fell. Well, first of all, Yeshua's people didn't believe in a devil or a hell. Period. Did not, do not. To this day. So what was he talking about? He's talking about Satana, the adversary, the one who distracts you from the unity. Your ego. Your ego. You. We don't need an evil archangel to mess up things in the world. We don't need a fallen archangel on earth messing things up that's just as powerful as God, because one, we don't even believe in that. To have a devil means that God don't exist. And we ain't down with that. But you can make trouble. Humans, evil exists, definitely. But it's usually humans acting as if there's no consequences to their action and they're not connected. So it's their ego that does that. So, Satana. Get thee behind me, Satana. So, Yeshua is coming out of the tradition that was taught in Egypt. Because the Mosaic tradition, Moses was raised in the state religion of Egypt. Because he was raised as Pharaoh's grandson. So he would be raised with this construct. 42 principles of Ma'at. Most of which are contained in the 10 Commandments. Could one come from the other? I'm just saying. So part of the piece here, symbolically, all right, is once you combine those two elements and become, as Tim pointed out, one-pointed, the symbology of that in the pyramid, this is a crystal pyramid. The 0 point, the 1 point is the top of the pyramid. It's invisible. You bring yourself to 1 point through your concentration using your breath. And then you manifest the world. You crystallize it. That's what the pyramid symbolizes. So then once you do that, nothing can move you. Let it rain, let it wind. It snowed in the pyramid once with global warming, whatever. In any case, it doesn't affect you. The most enduring structure. So that's a symbol for the realized human being.
Thank you. That's profundity.
Other symbols that I use, like the strings of the Korah, where you have Shiva Nataraj. Shiva is the destroyer and the creator. He's standing on tradition and innovation, and then the 7 principles of blackness, Emoja, Kujichagalia, Ujima, Ujama, Nia, Kumbha, Yamani, 7 levels of action, individual, informal, group, organization, institution, community, nation, globe, 7 products of culture, history, psychology, creative arts and sciences, politics, spirituality, economics, and social organization. All this collectively is called kawaida, basically based on traditional African principles that are problem solving. Just like algebra was problem solving, not just a means of calculating numbers, but personal problem solving with the assumption that you had all the wisdom of the universe inside you already. All you had to do is apply the correct principles.
What language is that?
That's Kiswahili. Another way of looking at it, using a pyramid, starting at the base with unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. And then putting that all together, several levels of social interaction and culture. Anyway, kawaida is a problem-solving matrix. Symbolic. Developed and then revivified with, if you notice this, I am in the corner. It's a project that I work with that was federally funded because basically the feds recognize that just say no ain't even working for white folks. So the black folks and the Latinos and the natives and the Asians said, okay, give us a crack. Let's say that culture is a better predictor. If we enhance culture, that will reduce substance abuse. So let's organize our communities to resist substance abuse.
Just say no didn't even work for Nancy Reagan. She was strung out on pills.
Well, yeah, it didn't work for, well, anyway. Well, I digress. But the IAM, the Institute for African American Mobilization, was basically a culturally specific institute, basically researched, written, and trained by us, by black folks, to basically address community organization around substance abuse issues. It was a 4-day training. And I participated, I wrote some stuff for it and some stuff that wasn't used for it, which you're getting as part of the class. And so, i.e. the strings of the Kora, for example, 6 types of isms, crash, all that stuff was stuff that the feds chose not to use. Any reference to Paulo Freire, the feds didn't want to use that because he was Marxist, but we're going, no, this stuff is working. So why don't we use it? Who cares if he was Marxist? We're not going to be Marxists here. But anyway. So, previously when I talked about logic and sense. So logic is a mentally constructed means of reasoning to an answer. The answer does not have to be true. It just has to conform to the logic system. Sense, conforming to what your 5 physical senses tell you: seeing, touching, hearing, tasting, smelling. All right, so sometimes logic doesn't square with sense. It should, but it doesn't. So logic should square with sense, but it doesn't always. So logic can unfold. So when logic doesn't square with sense, one of 2 things is happening. Check for them in this order. 1, check for the lie first. Something don't add up, somebody's lying. Check for that first. Try and disprove the lie first. A limited person is purpose, a limited person or a limited purpose is using logic to lie. Second, a higher purpose is causing logic to unfold in a different direction than you're used to. So you're being seen a higher truth, which is actually truth, not a lie. But you might not understand it. Why would the reason, no, I won't pose a question this way. I'll pose it this way because it's more radical and I'm feeling the force today. Why would the United States government kill Martin Luther King and then make a holiday out of his birthday? That doesn't make logical sense. But it was proven in a court of law with witnesses and never advertised, even though it was in a court of law. And if this happens at the Register Guard, it happens in major news outlets too. Some reporter at the Register Guard is always watching local court filings, etc., etc. CNN's paying attention to Jodi Arias and that murder trial. O.J. Simpson, the trial of the century, right, which was the mid-90s. This, a court of law, grand jury, basically found in a civil case where the King family only wanted $100 for the burial. Remember, Martin's already buried, so they just, this is symbolic. 70 witnesses. What happened? Did the government have a hand in killing our father? Jury found for the plaintiffs, i.e., yes, the government did. You would think that would be big news in 1999. Right? Bigger than OJ. Not one word. No coverage. Anywhere. That doesn't make sense. What's the logic?
They were still honoring J. Edgar Hoover's death.
Right, J. Edgar Hoover's been dead. Okay, so, higher purpose. If I'm telling you this from a higher purpose, saying this is the truth, all right? If I develop a process for turning gang members, lawbreakers, into Martin Luther Kings and Malcolm X, they already understand that Malcolm and Martin were killed for doing good work. And they're already ready to die. They were ready to die just for some stupid territory or turf or whatever. This is a higher purpose. So they're ready to die for that. But anybody who would organize them to do that becomes a terrorist. Just like Martin Luther King was considered by the United States government the most dangerous Negro in America, quote unquote, by J. Edgar Hoover. Why is Martin dangerous? Okay? He's driven by a higher purpose. All right, so logic unfolds. Either lies or growth can cause confusion, unless you retain a sense of connection to what is real and true. Higher purpose. So, for example, logical proof of racism. So, for example, point A, point B, point C, point D, for example, line up. Isolated incidents which only add up with the right proof in white eyes. Any one of them disallowed, it isn't racism in white eyes. Now, white is in quotes because it's not just white people, but people who adhere to a certain kind of logic. The logic of the American Psychological Association, which doesn't acknowledge racism exists as an emotional characteristic. They don't believe it exists or that there's any consequences. Okay? So, isolated incidents. So, a legitimate case of racism is when all four of these points square. The use of the symbology is deliberate. And then, oh, yes, we can say that's racism. So therefore, for example, the Supreme Court has said, it isn't racial profiling. You can't say that there's race unless you actually get a recording of the police officer using fighting words in the course of their encounter with you. That's the proof. Now, generally speaking, they're not going to allow that proof, or they're not going to know what to say, and they're going to stop you anyway. Okay, so logical proof. So it isn't real racism unless you can prove it with the rules of evidence that we're using. So for every quote-unquote legitimate case of racism seen by others, people of color see multiple instances of the same kind. So if the graphics work here, right? So The lived experience of racism. For each isolated incident, people of color see connection to others. So not just the point A, point B, point C, point D, they all stick together on a line. Each point is a lived, validated experience of racism by people of color, not validated by what? So it would look like, so where whites see a cube, rather a square, people of color's lived experience is a hypercube. So for every legitimate case you see, well, we see at least 16 others or more. We can just name them off that fit the same category, but you only see that one. And for every hypercube that we see, that's a 4-dimensional hypercube. This is a 6-dimensional hypercube. Same object multiplied. And notice how all these points are all connected. Which I was able to, I was in a meeting last week where I was getting dissed by the head of my union. We were trying to get a mandatory cultural competency training passed, and the faculty union, faculty council voted against it. Funny, other faculty won it. So I was basically doing a 1-minute speech, and I was interrupted by the phrase, "Get to the point." And I said, just because you don't see a point doesn't mean that there isn't one. Actually, there are several within that sentence. Okay? The proof is, not only have you dragged your feet on hiring, not only have you hired people that are hostile not only to faculty of color, but to students, white students, as well as students of color. That's why this initiative is being brought by students. So I can name 40 faculty that are supportive of this, which is well over 10%. So who are you representing? Not us. Not the faculty of color. So why don't you just call yourself the white faculty union and let's let it go at that.
That's what you said?
Mm-hmm. It has been said before multiple times. I've been here 21 years. So I'm not the only one to say that.
What is the response? I want to know that.
Oh, this is impersonal. Right. You got a Miles Davis ringtone on your phone, but
Still the status quo.
Wow.
yeah, wow. It's deep. So you can see why I might be on edge.
Gotcha.
Dealing with that stuff that you don't usually deal with backstage. I'm saying, all right, this is what you need to deal with, as you go up through academe, because I want you to go through academe so that we are populating places like this or out in the world, right? So this is a 10-dimensional hypercube. Same idea. So each point, if you understand the geometry, each one of these single points could be connected to thousands. But you might not see the connection if you don't know how to look, if you don't have the experience. But it's there. I could prove it.
That's the worldview.
Yeah, that's the worldview, right? So this is basically, so I'm using these symbols to say, okay, this is what our reality is. We're more complex than we are given credit for, right? So, in each lived experience, there are connections to those who have lived through and learned from the experience before and either lived to tell about it or, if it can be accessed, to tell about it. So, accessed in the realm of the invisible world, okay? You're part of a community of both suffering and strength. So, I can symbolically get behind Wiley Griffin, even though I wouldn't necessarily follow his survival tactic of being silent in the face of racism. As you know, I'm not. So, Naeem Akbar talks about the African self. Let me use this. What that graphic is, this is a dodecahedron. A dodecahedron has 12 sides. Okay, now in order to make a dodecahedron, each side is a pentagon. Okay, 5-sided figure. Okay, pentagon. All right, so back to slide if you would. So, the African self. Soul, body, mind, social, tribal. So, that is the African self, the ego, the African ego. This is from Naeem Akbar, a black psychiatrist, psychologist, and theorist, talking about, okay, what does a healthy African psychology look like? I often say, look, I'm a black Indian. We construct our reality knowing not only my history, but your history, especially if you don't know your history. And saying, oh, wow, this shit happened before. And it's repeating again and again and again and again. So maybe we can stop this. Okay? African self starts from the spiritual, the soul, your individual essence. The soul wears the body like your body wears clothes. Comes from the invisible world, it incarnates in the body, returns to the invisible world once the body dies. But it's always connected to the invisible world, your soul. Your body is your physical body. Your mind is your personal experiences, which includes in this construct your emotions, your feelings, your dreams. Your social self is basically your relationships. Because basic axiology for Africans is the highest value is the relationships between people as well as the invisible world. Then tribal ancestral, which if you're adopted, you may not know that, but you have a connection to the people that birthed you and the people before that and the people before that. All right, so let's say this is what Naeem Akbar talks about as the fivefold African self. Soul, body, mind, social, tribal, ancestral. So he's not saying that only black people experience this, but he's saying as far as our psychology goes, this is where we're coming from. Freud doesn't believe this stuff. Western psychology doesn't believe in spirituality. But you can't find a motivation for surviving being in a slave ship that isn't spiritual. It looks hopeless.
There's got to be something beyond.
There's got to be something
beyond
behind
that sexual reality.
Right.
At least laying down.
Right.
You know.
All right. So 12. I'm suggesting that you have 12 senses. So making sense of the invisible world. So you have 5 physical senses and 7 spiritual ones. So you add those up, you got 12 senses. So 7 spheres of Ra, as they were referred to in Egypt, or the 7 chakras, as I've talked about in Indian yoga, 7 steps to heaven, whatever you want to think about it in terms of there could be 7 levels of thought. So those 7 plus the 5 physical ones is 12 senses. So each chakra, if you will, or each sphere of Ra can be personally experienced at least 5 ways, but just say that there's 5 ways. Right? So spiritual, body, mind, social, tribal. Right? So each one, 5 ways. 12 of them. Complete human being. Dodecahedron. So what am I trying to say? You're a multidimensional being. Okay? And our teachings, our wisdom teachings, tell us this. But they're coded as they were in the old days. They're coded. So you have to decrypt the code. So this is where, so if you notice, this is a blurry image on the screen, but if you see it on television or in real life, where 3 of these come together, if you look at that exact one point where 3 of these 5-sided pentagons come together, you can see directly, you can see there's a cube in there, right? See that? It's darker. Indeed. Is it really there? Or is it a trick of the light?
Is that a top view?
Yeah. Actually, it's shooting. So when any 3 of these come together, basically you look straight on at the point where all 3 of them come together, you'll see a hypercube right behind it. In any direction. And only in that direction. You look straight on, you don't see it. You look at the interface of 3, you do see it. Next time the gem show goes, you can just pass this around and I can show you. All right? So I use that trick of the light to symbolize something. The 3 lower triangles, what we refer to in yoga as the lower triangle, that is the ego as defined by Freud. Okay? Survival, sex, and power. The 3 lower spheres of Ra, the 3 lower chakras, or the lower triangle, the ego. That's what Freud teaches you who you are. You're only concerned with survival, sex, and power. That's it. That's the human existence. All right? So I would say where the 3 lower chakras come together, that intersection point, it indicates that there's a higher structure. That hypercube. So that hidden structure is the 4 chakras of the higher self beyond the ego. Heart, throat, single eye, third eye, and the crown. I know, crazy, right? What am I talking about? Have any of you heard of Mafundi Lake? No?
No.
Okay. Who Greg Mafundi Lake was, he was a SNCC organizer. Therefore, he was involved with the freedom rides, voting registration in Alabama and Mississippi. And later, he, like many SNCC organizers, he became a Black Panther. You know how well Black Panthers would be accepted in the South.
Open arms.
Okay? So, he was arrested and put in a cell because in the South, obviously, the Klan had thoroughly infiltrated law enforcement. So they arrest him for doing voters registration or other type of work that the Panthers were doing, social activism work, equal justice work. So they put him in a jail cell with 20 other people. He's the only black. And then locked the door, walked away. Now, what would you logically expect to happen?
Killed or beaten.
Right. In the morning, he had organized them. All of them. What would a Black Panther say to Klan-friendly people to organize him? Okay, so you can't just use this logical, oh, we're both oppressed, blah, blah, blah. You have to actually convince them by the fact that you're not afraid and you have a spiritual conviction, and that is communicated beyond words. A power of presence. So I'm just saying, there's a higher thing in operation that won't be revealed by just looking at you. The authorities clearly expected to see him dead. And he wasn't. Actually, he's still inside now. Right? But you've never heard of him.
Probably got him isolated.
Well, sure. Like Mumia. Like, I can name, like Matula Shakur. Like lots of people doing good work, healing work, but that's illegal. Where's the logic in that? Who is threatened by that? Or are they in prison? Why have you never heard of them? There's a reason. One of the reasons is you don't want it, they don't want you emulating them. All right, so there's a hidden structure. So whether the structure is a cube or a hexagon, is it really there? Is it a trick of the light? It basically doesn't matter if you experience it. And those who experience it can communicate it to others and teach them how to do that. All right? So to quote Mary Anderson, the famous singer, she's talking about racism. Is it really there? Is it a trick of the light? What's the test? The test is, do you feel it? She said, sometimes it's like a hair across your cheek. She's talking about racism. You can't see it. You can't find it with your fingers. But you keep brushing at it because the feel of it is irritating. All right? So sometimes the racism is undetectable by your five senses. You're going to have to detect it with your spiritual senses. Can you feel it? Yeah, it's there. But can I prove it to others? Maybe so, maybe not. They might think I'm crazy. Can I share it with other people that have the same experience? Yes, they can validate it for you. And that's why you build that community of suffering and strength. Okay, is there a structure to the ism? Is it really there, a trick of the light, the way I'm seeing it? Satana's distraction. Nafs. Nafs is in the Muslim tradition. Nafs is ego. Nafs is what keeps you from submitting to the will of Islam. Islam is submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who submits. What keeps you from submitting is nafs. Nafs is the Muslim equivalent of Satana in Aramaic Christianity, but nafs is Arabic. Like they're like 7 kinds of ego. So, how to live. This is Paul Robeson. The man who accepts Western values absolutely finds his creative faculties becoming so warped and stunted that he's almost completely dependent on external satisfactions, and the moment he becomes frustrated in the search for these, he begins to develop neurotic symptoms, to feel that life is not worth living, and in chronic cases, to take his own life. Not necessarily through suicide, but through suicidal behavior. Like you hear like gang-related youth talk about they don't give an F. Right? Suicidal behavior. But white suicidologists say, oh, gang behavior is not suicidal. Really? In a drive-by shooting?
That's all it is. In the end.
And on the other side, how to live. I think it pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in the field somewhere and don't notice it. People think pleasing God is all God cares about, but any fool living in the world can see it's always trying to please us back. Ms. Alice Walker. So, within the disease, this is the union of opposites. Within the disease is the cure. Within the prison, the key to freedom. So, American values, or more traditional African values. Consumerism, that is being a hungry geist, that is a ghost that is basically gorging itself and is never satisfied, versus being content. Militarism, that is the ism of if you have a heartbeat, you are a target. Doesn't matter whether you're friendly or an enemy. You have a target, if you have a heartbeat, you're a target. So, strength through inner peace. Racism, human unity. So, certain types of American values, including consumerism, militarism, racism, are the prison. Within that prison, there's a key to freedom. Sometimes it's opposite. So, sexism, heterosexism, an integral gender expression. That is to say, one that is neither sexist or heterosexist and or racist, classist, etc., etc.